I'm Todd Green. I'm the Associate Professor of Religion at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa, and I teach courses on religious history and do research on Islam and Islamophobia in the West.
Can you help give us a working definition of what Islamophobia is?
Working definition of Islamophobia is an irrational fear, hostility, or hatred of Islam and of Muslims. It's also exclusionary or discriminatory practices aimed against Muslims. So Islamophobia can operate on two levels, both the attitudes one might have towards Muslims and the actions that might arise from those attitudes.
As we've sort of seen events unfold, particularly in the last week, there is all sorts of just so many different ways in which Islamophobia is sort of erupting, right, on social media and even within congregations. What would be faithful ways to address Islamophobia within the church, and particularly as pastors sort of engaging in these kind of conversations?
Yeah, this is very difficult. Addressing Islamophobia effectively really takes a long time. And so the solution to it, like any bigotry, dismantling any bigotry doesn't happen with one sermon or overnight, right? It takes a long time. Short term, at the very least, it's certainly incumbent upon leaders of congregations, whether they're lay leaders or ordained clergy, to challenge Islamophobic narratives in the media, amongst some politicians that we're getting right now. The example might be governors who have taken this strong stance against Syrian refugees coming into their states, and without any sort of evidence that there's anything to be afraid of. Right, but this is sort of a guilt by association. Syrians come from a country that's torn by violence, with ISIS sort of wreaking havoc, and Assad and others, and therefore all Syrians must be dangerous, must be inherent terrorists. And the church can challenge that and should offer a counter narrative, because most of the narratives we hear in the dominant media discourse and political discourse are Islamophobic. That's short term. What churches can really do long term is they can make interfaith work much more central to their identity. Not just, well, let's do interfaith work after real work of ministry has been done. Start to think of interfaith work as the central work of ministry. Reaching across cultural boundaries, religious boundaries, racial boundaries, whatever, and building relationships. The long-term solution to Islamophobia starts at the local level, and it can start in churches and other institutions, and it starts with relationships and building relationships, which I'm sure many people know can't happen overnight, not just with a cup of coffee or an interfaith luncheon. You have to maintain this over years, and with those relationships then come change in attitudes at the grassroots level, which then will put pressure on politicians and journalists and others to rethink the ways they tell the story of Islam.
You live in Decorah, Iowa, as do I, and there are many churches across our nation that are sitting in rural places, often without folks of faith, folks of the Muslim faith. And so I'm wondering, what does relationship building look like in rural communities where diversity just isn't existent?
Yes, well, it can happen in many ways in terms of how do you encounter the other, right? How do you encounter the Muslim other if you live in small town Iowa, even in rural Iowa, right? There's a significant Somalian community down in Postville, Iowa, not far from here, and a Jewish community at that too. So it's not that far. For even people who live in a place like Decorah. We of course have Muslim students on the campus like Luther, even though we don't have a lot. But relationship building can be done in other ways, and particularly in the age of social media networking and the internet and that sort of thing, and the traveling that many of us do. You can find ways to engage in sort of this relational response to Islamophobia by either getting on the computer, preferably getting out in person. So one thing I do is I take students out of Decorah and I take them to mosques sometimes up in Rochester or Minneapolis. I teach a study abroad course for Luther College students on Islam in Europe, and I take them over to Europe, and we visit 4 or 5 countries, and we spend a lot of time in mosques. We spend a lot of time talking with Muslims. For most of my students, it doesn't matter whether they're from the Twin Cities or from small town Iowa. For most of my students, it's the first time they've been in a mosque. It's the first time they've had any in-depth conversation with a Muslim, period. So that's just a reminder that it's not even just a sort of a rural versus urban problem. You can live in a big city and still segregate yourself from people, from diversity. In fact, we know historically that's very much been the history of the United States. And so all of us can break those boundaries down by getting out of our comfort zone, which means physically either leaving the small town we live in or leaving the neighborhood that we live in a larger city.
One of the things that we're sort of hearing and seeing in social media is this sort of very fearful response. And so wondering what are some best practices for engaging with folks who are really having this very fearful sort of place, who believe they're in danger either from Muslim neighbors or these sort of refugees that are coming or potentially coming. Right? We're seeing the news stories of, I think we're up to like 21 states who are attempting to bar refugees right now. I mean, what's sort of the prophetic response to addressing this fear?
The prophetic response, I would think, for addressing this fear is particularly from, say, the Christian theological tradition, is to remind people of all the resources that this tradition has when it comes to the refugee, when it comes to the stranger, and welcoming people who are different. This is not a minor theme in the biblical witness and traditions. This is a major theme. This is not a minor theme in U.S. history. It's a major theme, right? Not that there hasn't been a history also of xenophobia and negative and hostile responses to people who are different because of religion or race or geographical origin, but that the Christian tradition particularly has something to say about those seeking a safe haven, those who need a home, those who are the stranger. The person of Jesus, this is the embodiment of his ministry. This is his birth, right? This is a child born in a family that has no home, that's turned away from an inn. They're basically refugees of sorts. So digging into that tradition and making it very clear that this is welcoming refugees no matter where they're from is not sort of outside the sphere or the scope of the Christian tradition, but this is at the heart of what the gospel means. It's one of the most important things we can do, and I love it to hear ministers preach this word, and I want ministers and others in the Christian tradition to continue to put this out there in the public sphere, because when you hear governors weigh in, almost 20-something governors now weigh in saying we're not welcoming the refugee, many of those governors probably thinking they have the support of the Christian community. I hope to God that the Christian community responds by saying that is not the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Especially as we come in on Advent, thinking about that birth narrative and the immediate retreat into Egypt. I mean, we don't get bigger refugee narratives than that.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is the good news, right? And what we're hearing from the governor of Iowa, the governor of Arkansas, the governor of Texas, among many governors, is whatever it is, it's not the gospel.
One of the things you mentioned is this relationship building and about thinking about interfaith relations at times like this. And I'm wondering, as we engage in these different sorts of dialogues or building relationships, are there particular best practices we should keep in mind, or sensitivities as we go about engaging, or even sort of proposing different activities with different faith groups?
Yes, interfaith work, and I tell this to my students all the time, it sounds wonderful and you can get really excited about it as an abstract idea, but it's actually quite messy. It can be quite messy and quite difficult in building these bridges, particularly with minority religious communities that have been targeted for hostility, if not hatred, and there can be some reticence sometimes on the other end too, right? So we have to be careful in many ways, if you're in the Christian majority of the United States, to allow those with whom you want to build relationships to take the lead and to send the signals, right? And this is hard for Christian churches, that they're used to sort of steering the ship, right? An interfaith dialogue table oftentimes is a Christian-dominated table, and then we're gracious enough to allow other people to sit at our table, but that's really not how it's going to be effective in the long run. You do have to, in this case, if it's building relationships with Muslims, Muslim communities, you sort of allow Muslim communities in many ways to take the lead on this, and they'll let you know what they're comfortable with. Maybe a joint worship service is great with some Muslim communities and mosques, and maybe it's not for others. In my experience, anything that involves food can be quite helpful. We all like to, the idea of hospitality over meals is something that's really cross-cultural and intercultural. And so I encourage churches to think about that, and celebrating Eid, for example, or inviting Muslims to celebrate something in Christian communities. But also a big thing I support is studying one another's sacred text, but to do so in the presence of others, right? So a Quranic study group in the church, but or with the Christian community, but you do so, reading that text alongside Muslims, which I think is a very important to do today in light of how some people try to use the Quran as a weapon against Muslims and to increase Islamophobia. But there's all sorts of ethical issues and interfaith etiquette violations involved there. But reading these texts alongside people of other traditions and joining forces, doing social outreach together. I'm very much someone who's inspired by and follows the model of someone like Ibu Patel and the Interfaith Youth Corps. And what the Interfaith Youth Corps is all about on many college campuses is really just getting people doing things together, and then the conversations sort of come and arise from that. You don't have to twist too many college students' arms who are participating in faith communities on college campuses to say, hey, let's have a soup kitchen, or let's go respond to hurricane disaster relief somewhere. But what would happen if you were to have Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and others join together and take that road trip to a place like that, and they work together, and they just do they do work that is meaningful, that they see as an extension of their religious identity, and then let the conversation sort of flow organically, as opposed to sitting Jews, Christians, and Muslims around a table and starting off with, what do you think about Palestine? And my experience, that doesn't go very well because the relationships haven't been built. And the final thing I would say, and I think about this particularly the youth ministry, because this can start young. You have to wait till you're my age, right? Is for more churches to develop their children's and youth ministries in an interfaith direction. What would happen if confirmation classes weren't primarily learning your own text and the history from your own tradition, but you learned about your own tradition in relationship with and conversation with other traditions? So, say, in the context of a Lutheran church, Lutheran confirmation could involve learning about Luther's theology, some of the texts that he wrote, basic doctrines, but you also learn about Islam and you learn about Buddhism along the way too. In my experience, that doesn't take away from the Lutheran part. In many ways, it will sort of inspire our youth and frankly adults too to sort of dig deeper into their own tradition. It's like, oh, this is how Buddhists understand suffering. Well, what resources do we have about to deal with that? This is how Muslims understand the prophet Jesus. How do Christians sort of understand this, and what are their differences of opinion on that? And sort of integrate that more into the life of the educational curriculum of churches, of the activities of churches. That's simply what I want to see more churches do. That's what I mean by not making it an extracurricular activity, the thing you do after you do ministry. That this is the heart of what you're doing.
That full integration.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you wish every pastor knew at a time like this?
What do I wish every pastor knew at a time like this? I wish they knew a Muslim. I wish the friendships were already there. One thing I have certain about Islamophobia, which is sort of the position I come from, and I study this and I'm an activist about this, but I've learned in times like this responding with a lot of facts. I can tell you facts about Islam, but in my experience, particularly for someone who's really rooted in fear and anxiety, and we're in an anxious time right now, responding with facts oftentimes doesn't work. I wish my job would be a lot easier if it did. I just say, here's what Muslims actually believe about when the use of force or violence is necessary, or historically they believe that. And this is what they believe about, whatever. But it's difficult for people to hear in a time like this. So in a time like this, I wish ministers are already in a position to have developed relationships individually with Muslims, having their communities develop relationships with Muslims as well, so that they could be leaders in this conversation and sort of visualize what it means to be this interfaith community in many ways. That's sort of responding after the fact makes it quite difficult. So the answer to the question is, my first gut reaction is not to think, well, here's all the stuff I want them to know, which is important, but it's who do I want them to know.
As folks continue in studying Islamophobia and in studying Islam, are there resources that you find particularly helpful that are worth pointing folks towards?
Yes, with Islam, there's a lot of good books out there, and there's a lot of bad books out there, I should add. So not everything that has the word Islam in its title is on Amazon is something you should order. But the book I usually recommend to people who really are just coming at Islam fairly cold, aside from what they encounter in the media, would be John Esposito's What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam. And it's published by Oxford University Press. It's in Q&A format, so it's not a book you have to read cover to cover. It's easy to read a little bit and put it down and pick it up later, and it's organized around common questions people have about Islam who know little to nothing about it. And so that's one book that certainly comes to mind. And Islamophobia, I've written a book that's an introduction to Islamophobia that it kind of feels weird to plug your own book,
but it's an incredibly good book.
Writing the book, yeah. It's for an introduction for people who know little or nothing about this. What are the origins of this anxiety? How far back does this go? Is this just a 9/11 and after sort of thing, or has this been around a long time? And what's the political factors involved in this, and historical factors, and racial factors involved in the way the majority of the Western world has viewed Islam historically, or viewed Muslims historically? And that book is called The Fear of Islam, and that's also a good introduction. On the internet, for Islamophobia particularly, the best website I can direct people to that's sort of a clearinghouse for keeping track of Islamophobia in the United States particularly, and anti-Muslim incidents, is called the Bridge Initiative. And this is an organization within Georgetown University that was established, I believe, last year. But they do a phenomenal job of keeping track of this and also of trying to counter this narrative. A lot of what people like me do who are in this work of responding to Islamophobia is trying to offer other narratives, because there's a dominant narrative out there, and it's got a monopoly basically, and it's that Islam is inherently violent and it's trying to take over the United States, and it's misogynistic, and et cetera, et cetera. And the Bridge Initiative does a good job of finding different voices and providing different narratives, and also of alerting people to situations they come across that could be dangerous, such as rallies, in the spirit of that rally in Phoenix in May, where you had white supremacist bikers with guns protesting in front of an Islamic center, which the average Presbyterian will never have to worry about, right? But that's very dangerous, and it was the Bridge Initiative that really followed that story from the beginning and made it well known for all across the country, to the point that by the time they had the rally, there was a significant counter rally, and there was a lot of interfaith goodwill that started to emerge from that. And organizations like that are very helpful for anyone who wants to keep track of Islamophobia in the country, but also, to report to when they encounter Islamophobic incidents.
Great. Todd Green, thank you for being willing to chat and to sort of share what you know, and to give folks some resources on how to think through contextually how to think about what church life looks like going forward.
Yeah, well, no, thanks for having me. And I'm a big believer that church on the front lines, really, when it comes to combating Islamophobia. This is the difference with Europe. In Europe, churches have lost a lot of their influence. In the United States, they still have a lot of social capital. And if they start spending that social capital, I think you'll see the needle move on Islamophobia and go in the right direction.